New Israeli attacks in Lebanon after soldiers were killed for the first time since a fragile truce began in June. It comes despite more Lebanese-Israeli talks in Rome and a US brokered peace process. So where do things stand now? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Israel launches strikes in southern Lebanon after its first military fatalities since a truce started in June. The attacks came despite another round of US-brokered peace talks in Rome between Israeli and Lebanese officials. That process doesn't include Hezbollah, which the US and Israel say must disarm. Both place responsibility for that with the Lebanese government, but its military is weak. In Lebanon's south, Israeli media says its army is fortifying its presence there after obliterating towns and villages. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese remain homeless since Israel's latest invasion began in March, with more than 4,300 killed. So where do things stand now for Lebanon, and what are the hopes for the US peace plan for the country? We'll discuss this with our guests shortly, but first this report from Victoria Gatenby.
3 weeks of relative calm in southern Lebanon have come to an abrupt end. Israeli warplanes have struck villages just north of the zone occupied by Israeli forces. Israel says the attacks were in response to what it describes as a serious breach of the US-mediated ceasefire by Hezbollah. The armed group was not party to that agreement. It's the second such allegation in just a few days, adding to fears that tensions are rising once again. The latest strikes come as Lebanese and Israeli officials have been meeting at the US Embassy in Rome. They're trying to agree on a mechanism for implementing the framework deal, including how any Israeli withdrawal would be verified and how areas under Lebanese military control would be kept free from Hezbollah fighters.
Obviously, Israel's concerned about their security, but the president did a great job bringing those two countries together for the first time.
It's a big thing. First time in many years, right? So we have a deal with Israel and Lebanon, and yeah, they'll leave, and I think it's going to work out very well.
Lebanon was drawn into the war between Israel, the US and Iran in March when Hezbollah launched rockets into Israel. It said that was in retaliation for the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. Israel responded by launching a bombing campaign across Lebanon and invading a significant part of the south. Since then, more than 4,000 people have been killed and more than 1 million displaced. Despite a ceasefire agreed in June, Israeli forces have continued intermittent airstrikes and artillery fire across southern Lebanon.
Hostilities continue to affect civilians in southern Lebanon. Demolition operations, shelling, and other military activity are damaging homes, agricultural land, and civilian infrastructure. Many families are returning to severely damaged homes, limited access to essential services, economic hardship, and the threat posed by unexploded ordnance.
For civilians trying to rebuild their lives, the latest escalation is a reminder that the ceasefire remains fragile. For now, the violence appears to be contained, but the risk of a wider escalation remains. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's discuss all of this with our guests who are joining us on today's Inside Story. In Beirut, we're joined by Maha Yahya. She's director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. In Shawnee, Colorado, Jennifer Gavito is a former US acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. And in Boston, Rami Khouri is Distinguished Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Maha, because you are there in Lebanon, in Beirut. I suppose I should start with a simple question, given that a ceasefire technically has been in place since the 19th of June. Ceasefire, what ceasefire?
Thank you, James, for having me. It's good to be on AJE, on Inside Story again. Look, I think you asked technically in place, but it's been very much of a unilateral ceasefire. Ceasefire from an Israeli perspective until now has meant fire ceases from the Lebanese end, but it continues from Israel's end. As your reporter mentioned, limited strikes have continued across South Lebanon, uprooting of trees, dynamiting entire areas, villages, towns. More than 60 towns have been literally turned into mini Dresdens across much of, a significant part of South Lebanon. More than 200,000 people literally cannot go back home. And if they do go back, there's nothing left for them to go back to. Israeli bulldozers are changing even the topography of these areas. We're now hearing they're beginning to build some sort of infrastructure, roads in these areas. So the attack that happened yesterday happened within Lebanese territory. It's even, I think, in an area that's outside of the direct technically what the Israelis are calling the yellow zone or the buffer zone, which is just a misnomer for occupied Lebanese territory. But the attack that happened yesterday happened within this area. I mean, the continued unfortunate loss of life across Lebanon, but I would say broadly, even in Palestinian territories, in Gaza, even in some places in Syria, continues, because what I'm seeing is a military operation, multiple military operations with no clear political end in sight beyond war for the sake of war. The trilateral framework that Lebanon was forced into signing certainly is not one that will bring any kind of peace and security for either the Lebanese or for Israel.
Okay, just to explain what you mentioned there, Maha, what you mentioned there, the trilateral framework, the tri there being Israel, Lebanon, and the United States, Hezbollah not being part of the people that are at the table. Jennifer, you are a former senior US diplomat. If there is any progress, then it's going glacially slowly, is it not? Is this what you'd expect? I mean, should it be going as slow as this? Is this how very fragile diplomacy works? Or should we be worried?
I do think that this is what we should have expected for a lot of the reasons that Maha laid out, including the fact that Hezbollah, of course, is not at the table. And so commitments are being made on its behalf that the Lebanese government ultimately would have to follow through on. So I'm not surprised that things are going so slowly. There are complications that we can get into with regard to the, Israeli side of this. The fact that they have elections coming in October and significant resistance from their far right that is precluding any sort of meaningful progress. And the fact that the United States remains engaged in this, I think, is very positive. I think it's allowing for space for discussions that have not been able to take place in recent years, arguably in recent decades. So there are glimmers of hope, I think, to be found in this, but I tend to agree with most of what Maha laid out as far as what the challenges are, and think that if we do get to a place where there is greater coordination and greater progress possible, it's only going to come after painstaking negotiations that continue not for 7 rounds, but 70 rounds, and over the course of many months or years. So this is an extremely challenging moment. But again, I fall back on the idea that it's positive that the parties are still talking to each other, that they're discussing for the first time border demarcations prior to Hezbollah disarmament. So I think we keep plodding along and hoping that trust can be built.
Rami, you heard Jennifer there say the US remains engaged. Would you agree with that? Clearly, they are running these talks that have been taking place in Rome. But would you not also agree that perhaps the White House, and particularly President Trump, is somewhat distracted? We have had 2, as it were, conjoined wars, and all his attention is on the other one and the Strait of Hormuz, not on this.
Well, that's a good point, James. And there are many, many dimensions to this issue, this dynamic. And the role of the U.S. is a principal one here. And the weaknesses linked to the nature of Trump's leadership is a very important one, as you mentioned. But I think there's a broader weakness here, that the trilateral agreement that was reached and that is now being implemented is also the third leg of a three-legged stool of delusional agreements that the United States and Israel have tried to foment and force into implementation, one in Iran, one in Gaza, one in Lebanon. These are totally unrealistic, totally unfair, totally colonial agreements that are aimed to enforce the priority rights of the Israeli people and government and the priority interests of the United States corporate elite, and then the local people, Iranians, Palestinians, Lebanese, they'll get whatever's left over, a bit like the Oslo Accords in Palestine in the early 1990s. These are not serious agreements. They're not anchored in real law. They're not anchored in significant engagement with the principal parties. In all three areas, the principal parties, Hamas, the Iranian leadership, and Hezbollah, are not part of the negotiations. So this is really cartoon diplomacy, not serious diplomacy. But I also agree with both Jennifer and Maha that you've got to plod through this. You've got to keep talking to get the delusion out of these agreements and bring in some more realism and, more importantly, justice, equality. Unless there is a process by which the Lebanese people and the Israeli people benefit, there's not going to be any progress. And that process of mutual benefits is not underway yet. But the importance of a negotiation is that it can force people to change their positions as the negotiations go on. As you see with the Americans in Iran now, they're changing by the hour because they have no choice. And hopefully something similar will happen in Lebanon. The Israelis and the Americans will have to be more realistic. And the Lebanese government and Hezbollah will have to work out their issues, which I'm sure they can over time. So that's what I think we have to focus on, the bigger delusions as well as the local realities.
Maha, so many issues that need to be resolved on the table, but there is the chicken and egg in all of this, which is Israel demanding total disarmament of Hezbollah, Lebanon demanding total withdrawal of Israeli occupation. Does this trilateral agreement deal with that sequencing problem? And what do you see as the problems with the way this is being implemented at the moment?
Absolutely not. I mean, the way the trilateral agreement is framed, it basically has maximalist demands of Lebanon and minimalist demands of Israel. There's no time frame. The basically Israeli withdrawal and the preservation of Lebanese territorial integrity, which the framework recognizes right at the onset, but then goes on to undermine and says that Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory is contingent on the disarmament, and this disarmament will be verified by unknown sources, most likely Israel at this point. So the fact that Israel is the one that would be verifying that Hezbollah has been disarmed is already very problematic. We're seeing what's happening in Gaza and elsewhere, because then you can just stall and stall and stall. This is why everyone is worried about a very long-term occupation where facts on the ground are being changed. That's one. Two, it's basically taken what is an issue around an armed non-state actor, plus an external invasion of the country, and link them in a way where it's become an internal Lebanese problem. Basically, today, the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army is being asked to disarm a pretty strong non-state actor that's been in effect for the last 4 decades. In a very short time frame and without any kind of political processes in place. We know from other experiences, whether it's in Ireland or in South America or different places, you need to disarm a powerful armed non-state actor. You need there's a military component, but then there's a political component. Hezbollah is not just about the military, which frankly right now is under the control of the IRGC anyway, but there's an entire infrastructure of social services, social networks, people who are employed by Hezbollah that is not being considered at all. And internally in the narrative within the community, this is translating into the disarmament question is translated into a dispossession of the community itself, particularly because they're the ones who've been most affected by the Israeli invasion and occupation. And Israel's insistence on staying in these areas, ironically, they say they want to get rid of Hezbollah, but the very military acts it is undertaking are reinforcing Hezbollah's narrative that armed resistance is needed, and we can only, Lebanon can only be liberated, its territorial integrity can only be preserved if there is armed resistance.
Okay.
So the very actions that Israel is employing...
Let me bring in Jennifer, if I can, now. Jennifer, clearly, Maha is pointing out what she sees as serious flaws in this whole plan. Would you agree with that? I mean, the way they're doing it is choosing pilot zones to try and disarm, and then Israel should then, if Israel decides that it's verified, it should then withdraw. But so far in this process, Israel has so far handed back one village.
I completely agree with that. The pilot zones that we're talking about are a very small fraction of the territory of southern Lebanon that Israel currently occupies. And I think, as Maha noted before, there's infrastructure building that is happening that indicate that Israel intends to be there in some capacity for the longer term. The result of that, at least to my eyes, and would defer to my Lebanese colleagues on the panel, but that represents a real undermining of the Lebanese government itself. And you're absolutely right, Maha, that there needs to be a reconciliation process. The Lebanese population needs to be brought along. But as long as these attacks and evacuation orders are being given in southern Lebanon, that really denies the Lebanese government the support that is necessary in order to take on the very difficult task of disarming Hezbollah. And I think that chicken and egg question that you started with is a very important one, and indicates that a lot of the details in this agreement, just like the details in the Hamas disarmament that was announced by the United States last week, remain unresolved. There are a lot of parallels there. But certainly for Israel, which continues to view Hezbollah, and I think understandably so, as a threat. There are communities in northern Israel as well that can't be occupied. As long as Israel considers Hezbollah, or Hamas as it were, to be a threat, I think that we've seen that Israel's government, and certainly the Netanyahu government, will continue to act in their own national security interests. Where I would disagree with Rami a bit is I do think that the Trump administration deserves some credit for breaking with the Israeli government in ways that we've not seen previously, and for trying to pressure the the Israeli government into at least going along with some of the talks that are taking place. And so there is much that remains to be done. But I do think the Trump administration is trying to create the space for those discussions to occur and to pressure the Israeli government to pull back a bit on the actions that it would take. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is there a lot of detail that still has to be worked out for this to have even the most remote chance of working? Absolutely. But again, I do think that talking and dialogue are preferable to being in a perpetual state of conflict.
Rami, one village handed back. Let me get you to just explain to us the scale of all of this. And this is from an Israeli newspaper. Haaretz did a calculation that Israel currently controls 602 square kilometres. At this pace, it would literally take years and years to hand back all of this territory. And in the meantime, the people of southern Lebanon are suffering. Hezbollah, as you mentioned before, not just a military movement, but also a social movement, but it doesn't have the money it used to have.
Right, yeah, James, you raise a very important point, as you always do. The scale of what Israel is doing with direct and, I would say, enthusiastic American support over the last 40 years or so has been to de-sovereignize the Lebanese government and to create conditions in the south of Lebanon that are very, very difficult for ordinary people, many of whom have been displaced 5 or 6 times. And I've witnessed this in the 30 years I lived in Lebanon. And you have people like in Burj al-Shamali town, a village in the south, who were who had to leave. They fled. Much of their town was destroyed. They came back recently, and they were attacked again. Or in the Mansouri village, which was attacked yesterday, while people were still trying to get on with their lives. So the pattern is that Israel can attack anybody, anywhere, anytime, in any part of the, let's call it the Levant, Western Asia. This has been the pattern really since the 1960s. There's no sign of this being reduced. I agree with Jennifer. It is a good point that Trump did initiate some talks and some pressures on the Israelis. But when you see what he did in Gaza, similarly, after a couple of weeks, he lost attention and the Israelis ignored him. And so there's no lasting impact yet of what Trump has done. So I think we have to give him time to measure if what he's doing is really serious. My impression is that it's not very serious, that the Israelis have recognized they are alone, not in the whole world, but certainly they're alone in most of the world. Public opinion and governments are critical of them. They have to rely on themselves and on their military and their intelligence and spying services for their survival. That's their perception. I think it's wrong. I think a better way to survive is do what they did with Jordan and Egypt, which is sign really equitable, balanced peace agreements that give both sides their rights, and therefore those agreements have held. And they need to do the same thing with Lebanon and the Palestinians and the Syrians and everybody else. But we're never going to get out of this cycle by doing these kinds of make-believe negotiations that are going on now and ignoring the principal actors. The U.S. did that in Vietnam and in Afghanistan for decades. They ended up negotiating with the Viet Cong and leaving, negotiating with the Taliban and leaving. The same thing is happening in Palestine with Hamas, or the PLO first, now Hamas. So I think there's a sense of realism that's missing in the American legacy of diplomacy in this region. And what we need to do is simply, in all of these situations, and Lebanon is the most dramatic, partly because it's been going on for so long, is focus on mutual, equal, simultaneous sovereignty, security, legitimacy, pluralism, and development.
Maha, if I can bring you in, I mean, Rami there draws the parallels from other parts of the region, and particularly the striking one of Gaza. We have, according to the UN, 360,000 people displaced, no housing, no electricity, very limited water supplies. And, of course, Hezbollah has provided for these people in the past. The Lebanese government's not had a presence in these areas for decades. What happens to these poor people?
Perpetual displacement. Just a slight nuance. I think it's unfair to say that the Lebanese government has not had a presence in these areas for a long time. It has been, but like everything else in this country, it's gone through institutions that are quite hijacked by the local political parties. Since this new government came into place, they've had various programs that have catered to the displaced, but also to the poor across Lebanon. I can mention one program, for example, that is run by the Ministry of Social Affairs called Aman. There are many other programs, but don't forget also that this is a government today that is coming to, I mean, the country is bankrupt. There was a 2019 financial collapse, which has yet to be addressed by Lebanese lawmakers. No reform has happened. So fiscal space to take on the even humanitarian needs is simply not there. What is more critical, I think, or just as critical, is that the international community for the past year and a half has dealt with the disarmament of Hezbollah and the strengthening of the central state, the support, financial and other support for the central state, as if they're two opposing goals. The fact is, you cannot disarm Hezbollah. You cannot deal with the social and economic needs of a displaced population if you don't have a central state.
Okay.
These are
I want to bring in Jennifer again one more time at the end of our discussion. Jennifer, do you think Israel, and particularly the current Israeli government, actually wants these people in southern Lebanon, the people in Gaza, wants them to have a better life? Or do you think it just wants to leave them in limbo and in an incredibly weak state?
Unfortunately, I'm not convinced of the Israeli government's desire to fundamentally reshape its presence in southern Lebanon. Certainly not under the current Netanyahu government. We'll see if things change after October. I agree with Rami that a much better model would be a peace agreement with the neighbors like the ones that they have in Jordan and Egypt. But that isn't the model that they've pursued in recent years. And one other comment on that, in the meantime, I do think that the international community has a significant role to play in at least setting the stage for this to be successful if that dynamic does change. But it requires an enormous amount of investment in the reconstruction of southern Lebanon for all the reasons that my colleagues have laid out. And I'm not sure that despite, some sustained U.S. attention on this, that the type of resources needed for that reconstruction are going to come from the U.S. government. At the same time, the Gulf governments, which I think had been envisioned to support some of the reconstruction efforts, are of course focused on their own economies in light of the ongoing war in Iran. And so there is a gap that's being left that I think Hezbollah is able to continue to fill. And that leaves the suffering of the Lebanese people front and center in the lack of progress towards any sort of long-term resolution here. So those dynamics, I do think, have to change, even as Israel really has to assess the benefits of continuing this perpetual state of conflict versus finding some sort of formula that allows it to retreat and move forward with a more peaceful neighbor.
Thank you very much indeed to our guests today, Jennifer, Gavito, Maha, Yahya and Rami Khouri. For more on the situation in Lebanon and the latest diplomacy across the region, why not check out our website, aljazeera.com. We'd like to hear your views too. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or why not find us on X? Tag us in your post at AJ Inside Story. Until next time, that's it from me, James Bays, and all the team here. But don't go away. Al Jazeera's coverage from around the world continues in just a moment.